Uncertain, Chapter 6, Baron. Kevin led them back upstairs to the mechanic's shop. He stepped over to Ed and tapped him on the shoulder.
Need to pull out the DX-10.
Ed frowned, glancing over at the others.
Bit early. Birthday's not till December.
Kevin nodded.
Yeah, but it needs to happen anyway.
Ed shrugged and nodded. He led them to one of the stalls marked out of order. Pulling the garage door shut behind him, he proceeded to pull out a key from his pocket. He slipped it into the hole on the lift and turned it, nodding to Kevin. The floor unfolded and a covered car was lifted out of the ground. Jen rolled her eyes. You complain about Humongosaur breaking your car when you already have a standby? Kevin's grin was mischievous.
It's not for me.
Before they could ask what he meant, he pulled the covering off the car. It was sleek, a streamlined sports car painted black with the green X starting just under the front bumper and coming up over the hood. All the windows were tinted and the wheels had the signature green hourglass with plumbers painstakingly detailed in the center of the hubcaps. Jen whistled. Who's it for? She asked, unable to keep the awe out of her voice.
You,
Kevin stated. Jen blinked up at him. Ethan found his voice first.
Your friend built you a car?
Ethan sounded incredulous. Jen shook her head. Why?
Well, it started as a car for Gwen, for her birthday. But her parents weren't comfortable with her driving yet. Yours, though. They're very relaxed people.
Jen laughed. Kevin brushed some non-existent dust off the pristine paint job.
Anyway, I was gonna give it to you, but that was before you went AWOL. Ditched the team. I'm keeping her.
No, I'm driving. Kevin raised an eyebrow.
How do you figure?
Jen's grin was downright predatory. Humongosaur would be more than happy to throw the car to Missouri. Kevin glared for a moment before tossing her the keys, the glare only intensifying when she actually caught them. Ed laughed and spoke up.
Weapons and defense systems aren't online yet, but she'll run. Once she's finished, she'll eat anything in her way.
Kevin gloated, and Jen nodded, running a hand along the sleek metal of the car. It's beautiful, Kevin, Gwen said with a smile like she'd known the whole time.
She,
Kevin corrected.
You call a car a she, and yes, she's beautiful.
Kevin wrapped an arm around Gwen's waist.
Don't be jealous. You've got some good qualities, too.
He planted a kiss on her forehead as she elbowed him. Get what you need. We leave in 10 minutes. Ed nodded, and everyone but Kevin headed back down to the hole. The three of them still had blood on their clothes from Jen's broken nose, after all. Jen had been keeping a spare set of clothes here for a while, even a spare jacket, which was lucky as hers had not avoided the blood. Gwen had a spare set too, though it wasn't her usual blue sweater and white button-up. This was a red shirt and black vest. Jen shoved the blood-stained clothes into the washing machine hidden in the back room and added some soap. Ethan knocked on the door and smiled sheepishly, holding up his own shirt. He was now in a spare of Kevin's. It was just a touch big on him, but Jen thought it was cute. They all met back up at the new car, and Jen grinned as she sat in the driver's seat. Shotgun, Ethan claimed, and grabbed the door handle before Kevin. Gwen snorted and pulled her boyfriend into the back seat. Jen carefully pulled out of the garage and out of Bellwood. Once they were on open, empty back highways, though, she opened the throttle and raced down the asphalt. Oh, I love it. Kevin leaned forward from his spot in the back seat.
I'm so glad.
His words dripped with sarcasm, but Jen couldn't find it in herself to care. With the car's boosted engine, it didn't take them long to reach Barren Rock. The town was deserted. It looked like the aftermath of a disaster movie. Cars abandoned in the streets, grocery bags and their contents strewn on the pavement by still open car trunks. Dogs ran through the streets and howled from houses, but there was no time to stop and help them. Jen had looked up the map of Barren Rock and discovered it had a hiking trail not even half a mile from the Ship It Center. She parked there in the deserted lot, and they got out, Jen slipping the keys into her pockets after clicking the locks into place. They made their way to a rise that overlooked the Ship It Center, and Kevin pulled out a pair of binoculars.
Lot of people down there.
He handed them to Gwen. Looks like this is where the whole town disappeared to. I don't think anyone got away. She handed the binoculars to Jen. Her teammates were right. There were a lot of people down there. Some of them were in work uniforms from other jobs. Some were in sports uniforms, mostly the kids. A few were in regular street clothes, and here and there she spotted people in their pajamas. Like I said, total immersion. She handed the binoculars to Ethan.
How do we get in?
Kevin asked. We can't go in guns blazing. They'll have more than enough time to activate the chips, Jen said. They looked like they'd been rendered dormant for shipping. Maybe we can get in and take out the Queen before they can activate the chips. Then we'll be okay, Gwen commented.
Still doesn't answer how we get in,
Kevin pointed out. Ethan turned, still looking through the binoculars.
Front gate's open.
He handed Jen back the binoculars and pointed. He was right. The gate on the Ship It Center parking lot was open and unguarded. A few cars were parked in the employee lot, including a truck from Ed's mechanic shop. Grandpa Max was here then. Jen pushed that thought aside, and as her nose throbbed.
Looks like a mostly clear shot to the buildings, but we'll still get spotted.
Kevin pulled a device out of his pocket.
Cooper finished this while you were in space. It only has enough energy for maybe 10 minutes before it has to recharge, though, and we'll have to stick close together.
He held up the device. It looked like a small TV remote with only one button. The cloaking device! Go Cooper! Kevin nodded, and the four of them made their way down the ridge. Kevin flicked on the device, and a wave of energy passed over them. I don't really feel invisible, Ethan said, without confidence, but Jen took his hand and Kevin took Gwen's. Together, they made their way inside. Even with Cooper's cloaking device, it was slow going. The cloak did nothing to muffle sound, and they had to stop a few times and hold their breaths as several of the drones looked around as if searching for the source of disembodied footsteps. They were almost inside when Gwen spotted Grandpa Max. He was holding a clipboard and seemed to be directing the drones that were getting ready to drive off with trucks full of chips. Jen caught Gwen as she made to step forward. No, we can't help him. If he sees us, he alerts the others we don't belong. We lose. The brunette hissed in her cousin's ear. Gwen let out a shaking breath and nodded. They made the rest of the way inside and up onto a catwalk overlooking the main operation before the cloak gave out.
Well, we're in. How do we find the Queen?
Kevin asked softly, not wanting to alert the drones on the ground floor. He slipped the cloak back into his pocket. Jen shook her head, looking around the room. The scene was unusual, to say the least. People of every age worked on the assembly line, filling canisters with dormant chips, placing those canisters into crates to be shipped out around the world. The oddest thing, though, had to be the figure at the center of the room. He stood elevated above the rest, hooked up to tubing, chips pouring from them into large carts below. These were collected and moved to the assembly lines. There's someone we know. Jen pointed to the man hooked up to the machine, the freak from the drop. It was him. She recognized his trench coat. His head was twitching spastically, almost like he was having small seizures. Gwen had been examining the crowd on the assembly line, but her eyes flicked up to the man in the trench coat and widened. Jen, that's that's Victor Validus. Jen blinked in surprise. The man's head twitched again. He looked thinner, older, and much wilder than Jen remembered him, but there was no mistaking it. Kevin snarled and grabbed Ethan by the front of his borrowed shirt.
You knew the whole time, didn't you?
Possessed by his work? Really? Jen griped as she pulled Kevin's hands off of Ethan. I told you not to trust him, Gwen bit out. You said you didn't know him. Jen's voice was steady, but only because right now she was too focused on getting everyone out of here alive. She didn't have time to be angry right now. She could do that later, assuming they lived.
I don't. That's not my dad. He's become some kind of monster. He attacked me, just like Max attacked you.
Ethan pulled the collar of Kevin's shirt down to reveal a patchwork of bruises decorating his skin. They were slightly faded, as if they had already begun to heal. Jen glanced back at Victor Validus. Well, we found out how they're making the chips, Gwen said, rubbing her forehead. Ethan flinched, his eyes filling with tears. Kevin wasn't done, though.
You really expect me to believe you're on our side?
Jen turned to the taller boy. That's rich, coming from you. Dark eyes narrowed at her.
What's that supposed to mean, Tennyson?
I'm just saying, at least Ethan never tried to kill me. Kevin's glare intensified.
Just because you never got over your stupid middle school crush.
Gwen put a stop to their argument. "Shut up!" she hissed and grabbed Kevin by the arm and Jen by her shoulder. The brunette caught Ethan's arm and Gwen tugged them around the corner and down a set of stairs. She pressed a finger to her lips as they ducked into a side hall. Several pairs of footsteps went past them and up the stairs to the catwalk as the teens held their breath. Chapter 7. Absorbed. They managed to dodge the drones until they made it to a small section of the warehouse floor, separated from the rest of the room by a few rows of lockers. Kevin grabbed one and absorbed the metal before stepping towards Ethan threateningly.
"They're in this together. This is a trap."
Jen stepped in front of Kevin, blocking his attack. "He gets a chance to explain himself. We gave that much to you." Kevin didn't release the metal, but he did step back. Gwen didn't look so ready to give Ethan a chance, though. "Jen, he lied. His father's controlling the chips." Jen shook her head, peering out at the room at large behind the few rows of lockers. "I don't think that's quite right. I think they're controlling him like they did Max, but Ethan gets a chance to tell us why he lied." She turned back to Ethan, who had tears running down his face. He wrapped his arms around his chest.
"I had to lie. I knew no one would help me if they thought my dad was behind this."
He glared at Kevin.
"But that thing isn't my dad. I told you the truth. He kept disappearing off to the lab I took the chips from, but when he stopped coming home and I went to go check on him, I found that thing."
He gestured at the larger section of the room beyond the lockers. They were all keeping their voices low, desperate not to draw attention.
"He was talking crazy about a swarm coming to engulf humanity. Then he threw a chair at me. Told me I'd make a good pawn. I escaped with a few canisters and went to find the plumbers. About a week later, Helios set up the meeting with Frisk, and I found you."
Jen nodded. "I would have hoped you knew me better than that, Ethan. I'd have helped from the beginning. Next time, don't lie." She turned back to the gap between lockers, watching the chips flow from the tubes attached to Victor Validus. "That explains those plans." She kept going, not noticing the confusion on Gwen and Kevin's faces. He was experimenting on himself, not just the chips. He's the hive. His body's producing the chips by the thousands. Jen turned back to the group as realization dawned on Gwen's face. In a hive, only the queen can reproduce. Understanding lit Kevin's eyes at her words.
"That means the queen is inside my dad."
Ethan choked out, fresh tears streaming down his face.
"We have to take him down,"
Kevin said with finality.
"No!"
Ethan cried out. "I'm sorry, Ethan, but one life against a whole world?" Gwen cut in. Jen shook her head. "I don't trade lives." "It's what Grandpa Max would do." Jen shot her cousin a dirty look. "I don't know what Grandpa Max would do, but I know what I won't do."
"Then what are we going to do?" Kevin asked.
"If I can take out the queen, the other chips die, right?" Gwen nodded. "That's the theory. But what are you going to use? Big Chill doesn't possess people like Ghost Freak used to. Alien X, maybe, but what happens if she gets absorbed by the hive?" "Absorbed by the hive was kind of my whole plan," Jen said, looking down at the watch.
"What? You can't!" "No."
Ethan grabbed her arm.
"I already lost my dad to them. I don't want to lose you too."
"We don't have a choice. The Omnitrix finished scanning their DNA when Grandpa attacked me. It's time to use their own weapons against them." Gwen shook her head. "This is really stupid, Jen," Kevin snapped.
"This is really stupid, Jen,"
Kevin snapped. "Kevin's right. This isn't like anything you've ever become. This is a hive mind organism. What if, when the Omnitrix turns you into one of these things, you lose control?" the redhead demanded.
"You could become a permanent slave to the hive. A turbocharged, killer weapon slave."
Jen shook her head.
"Please don't do this,"
Ethan begged. Jen squeezed his hand. "I don't do this, the whole world falls. One against millions." Gwen squeezed her eyes shut. Jen was always extremely heroic. It was in her nature. But it often meant that her own personal safety got set aside. Their argument was cut short, though, when a pair of arms came around one of the rows of lockers and grabbed Kevin from behind. He grunted as he grabbed the offending drone and flipped him hard, sending several lockers crashing to the ground and silencing the entire assembly floor. "Really no choice now. Keep him busy. I'll be as quick as I can." Gwen nodded as more drones came around the corner. Jen spun the dial on the Omnitrix. Ethan caught her eye as he grabbed one of the doors that had fallen off the locker Kevin had knocked down.
Please come back to me.
Jen nodded and twirled the dial over to the new alien. She slapped down the dial and green lights flashed. Gwen glanced down at the spot where her cousin had been. In her place was a figure no taller than Gwen's thumb. It was human in shape, but entirely mechanical. A single bright green eye blinking in the middle of its face. It looked up and down its own legs and arms. It was made of dark metal, like the chips, but the energy that coursed visibly through it was green. Looks like a nanomechanical organism, sort of like the chips, but different. As Gwen spoke, wings sprouted from Jen's back.
Nanomech, I like it.
The voice was high-pitched, nearly inaudible. But Gwen didn't have time to focus on that. The newly christened nanomech took off and vanished above the heads of the oncoming crowd. Flying through a nasal passage, even microscopically, was nasty. Shrinking down even further, passing into the brain itself, might just have been worse. But the soothing, crackling voice that invaded her skull was by far the most unpleasant thing.
Listen to my voice.
Her wings sputtered as the voice reached into Jen's brain, gripping and grasping for control.
You're one of us now. Why care about the humans when the universe can be yours?
No! Jen lashed out at the queen. This chip looked more like the insects that the chips behaved like. A wasp, slightly bigger than Jen herself, its stinger embedded in the gray matter of Victor Validus's brain. The queen shrieked as green lightning flashed through her. It yanked the stinger out of the brain matter and came after her.
You're different than these other drones. Together, you and I could rule everything,
the voice hissed. You know, I honestly have my eye on somebody else right now, and ruling the world sounds like a fucking headache. The queen hissed and attacked again. Gwen had no idea what Jen was doing. It was impossible to watch a fight happening in someone else's head, after all. All she could see over the crowds of people was Victor Validus's head twitching much more than it had been. He seemed to be grunting in pain, too. But Gwen was busy with her own problems right now. She was holding her own against a never-ending horde. Kevin was holding his own, too. Even Ethan, who ditched his locker door for some rusty pipes he'd found lying around, was holding out against these things, but the chips in the canisters were starting to twitch and skitter. They weren't glowing with life yet, but they had maybe a few minutes before the literal end of the world.
What is she doing in there?
Kevin bit out as he kicked another of the drones. He was coated in stone. He'd likely be safe from the chips like that. But how long he could actually keep it up, Gwen had no idea. Gwen shook her head.
We're almost out of time. The chips are activating. I can shield us for a while, but I don't know how long.
Kevin reached out and took her hand, warm stone fingers squeezing hers.
Then you will die like the humans,
the queen hissed, sprouting what looked like loose electrical wires from her back. Jen screamed and writhed. The queen laughed.
You were a fool to turn into a drone. I can easily defeat any puny drone.
Oh, I'm not just a drone. I'm upgraded. Drones can adapt. She pulled away from the queen, copying the programming for the wires with a simple touch. And lady, I never give up. The queen screamed again as Jen caught her, and green fought with yellow for just a moment before Jen let every ounce of frustration at the situation course through her as electricity, and the queen burst apart in a flash of orange light.